Today I wanted to talk about something I've noticed in paganism today. It's kind of a phenomenon that I'm calling Protestant paganism. And what it really is I've noticed that there's a lot of people out there who are treating pagan works, things like Homer, Hesiod, as though they're divine revelations, that they're these sort of infallible works that we have to base the entire religion around, the same way that you might base a religion around the Bible, right, as a divine revelation, or the Quran, or any other kind of revelatory work. And I think it's worth talking a little bit about the nature of pagan religion and how it's not a revelatory religion from the start, and how that kind of mindset is really something that I think sneaks into paganism as sort of carried in these religious assumptions that we have. It's just assumptions about how religion works and what the nature of religion is. You know, I keep seeing this kind of over and over again, people trying to establish a kind of revelatory nature to paganism and say, hey, these works are the infallible truth and we just have to follow them, and to question them is blasphemy and yada yada. And really overall, this is a much more Protestant framework in thinking about religion than it is a pagan one. And I want to go into that a little bit more about, the differences between these two different mindsets and the way that we treat religion and the way that we treat our divine poetry. So really we're kind of asking the question is like, why do some modern pagans look at Homer, Hesiod, and treat those texts as though they're infallible? And I think this could apply to Norse pagans that might treat the Eddas in the same way. Really anybody that wants to take a particular text and, turn it into basically the equivalent of the Bible, and why that doesn't fit with paganism and why we do it differently. So let's define this problem a little bit. I notice it's kind of tied to a couple different things. There's obviously the text side of it, trying to assign certain texts to being these infallible works that are the foundation of everything, that, basically we get to a point where we want to say, everything has to relate back to what Homer said. And if there's any question in regard to religion, all those questions refer back to Homer or the Eddas or whatever. And then we're going to just go from there. And if Homer says this, then that's the end of the debate, right? It's like divine revelation has spoken. So that's one side of the problem. But what I notice also is kind of carried in with that assumption is a rejection of philosophy, right? So people who try to ask questions about the gods or try to figure out what the gods are or make a theology based on logic and reason, very often that approach is deemed as some kind of degradation, or like you're trying to rationalize the revelations or something like that. So very negative attitude towards the impulse towards philosophy. So that's this mindset that I'm calling out as Protestant paganism. And I think it needs a term, really. That's really part of the reason why I'm making this video, is we need a way to single out what this perspective is. And I think the best term for it is Protestant pagans, or paganism, because it's really what it is. It's taking this kind of sola scriptura mindset that we see emerge in Protestantism in the Middle Ages, essentially, or late Middle Ages, whatever you want to call it, where Scripture is determined to be the only thing that we focus on, where it's the thing that matters is your interpretation of the Scripture. If you want an answer to something, you go to the Bible, and that's the be-all, end-all. It's not about the church or some philosophy or anything like that. You just go directly to the Bible and you figure it out for yourself, that kind of mindset. And I think this is really just being grafted onto paganism in a way that's very unnatural, and it never worked like this in antiquity. And it's part of what I want to go into, is kind of showing how our religion doesn't operate like that. And I can make a couple of assumptions about why maybe this is happening. I do think that some people have some unexamined ideas about religion, and they just assume that that's what religion is. Religion is taking an old book or an old work and elevating it to the level of divine revelation and then following it without question. That's at least what, how religion sort of works in Protestantism, but ancient paganism never really operated like that. So I want to introduce a framework to think about this that I think is really useful. And it's from a philosopher named John Osman. I may be pronouncing that wrong. He's a German guy, I think. So it might be Jan Osman or something like that. But either way, he's written a bunch of great books like Moses the Egyptian and The Price of Monotheism. And I don't think he developed this idea, but he certainly promoted it a lot and talked about it in his books. I think somebody else actually created this. But he has this dichotomy that he talks about between primary and secondary religions. He has a couple other terms for it. One of them is the primary religions are natural religions, and secondary religions are called counter religions. So natural and counter religions, or primary and secondary religions. So I'm going to read a quick definition from his book, The Price of Monotheism, to kind of set the stage for this interesting development that I've noticed. So he says, the distinction between primary and secondary religions goes back to a suggestion made by the scholar of religion Theo Sundermeyer. Primary religions evolve historically over hundreds or thousands of years within a single culture, society, and generally also language, with all of which they are inextricably entwined. Religions of this kind include the cultic and divine worlds of Egyptian, Babylonian, and Greco-Roman antiquity. Among many others, secondary religions, by contrast, are those that owe their existence to an act of revelation and foundation. They build upon primary religions and typically differentiate themselves from the latter by denouncing them as paganism, idolatry, and superstition. All secondary religions, which are at the same time book, world, and with the possible exception of Buddhism, monotheistic religions, look down on the primary religions as pagan, even though they may have assimilated many elements of primary religions in the course of a syncretistic acculturation. They are still marked in their self-understanding by an antagonistic acculturation, and they have strong ideas about what is incompatible with the truth or orthodoxy they proclaim. Okay, it's a lot of stuff there. But generally what we see is that these primary natural religions, they're open, they evolve over time, they're cultural, they tend to be much more pluralistic, and they focus on things like myth, ritual, and philosophy, and all of those things coexist together comfortably in the religion. So a good example of this, of one that's still alive today, is Hinduism. Hinduism is still a primary religion, and it never moved into a kind of secondary religious phase. In some sense, Buddhism is a secondary religion that kind of comes off of the Hindu religion, although Buddhism kind of strikes a balance point between, I think, primary and secondary religion and doesn't become overly revelatory or denouncing of Hinduism that much. So it's kind of doesn't fit the mold perfectly. Whereas secondary religions, though, we see these as being scriptural. They're exclusive. So there's a strong sense of who's in, who's out. There's a tendency towards calling people heretics or blasphemers, denouncing people. And the revelation is fixed. And this is really important. There's a revelation and it's fixed. There isn't like an open-ended revelation where over time we're going to have more and more revelations coming in. It's very much like, no, there was a revelation, now the revelation is closed, and we have this sort of closed system. So you see that in the Bible where, for Jews, for example, the Hebrew Bible is it. It's a closed revelation. After the Hebrew Bible, there's no more revelations. They can make commentaries about it in the Midrash and all of these other documents, but it's done, right? There's no new revelations coming to Judaism. And then Christianity comes around and they add the Gospels and the letters of Paul and Revelation and basically the New Testament. And then they say, nope, it's done. Revelation is closed after that. There's no more new revelations. We had the last one, guys. It's closed. And then they just focus on that. They make commentaries on that, but there's no new revelations. Then you have Islam comes out and they go, well, we got one more revelation from Muhammad, and this one's the final revelation. We have the final prophet. Then all revelation is closed. There's no more revelations after that, right? So you're probably noticing a trend, right? That there's this idea that there's a revelation and a fixed point in time, and you can't develop it anymore. It's just closed off. And this is where Buddhism also doesn't really fit this mold very well, because there's new sutras that get written over time that are become even more important than the things that the Buddha wrote about. So it's not really revelatory in that way. So that's a good kind of basic framework of what is secondary religion. And I think this reaches really a culmination, like a pinnacle in something like Protestantism that becomes kind of like the most secondary religion, because they really went to a great effort to remove anything within Christianity that could have been a part of that primary religion, right? They were trying to like flush out any of these older kind of pagan elements of the religion as much as possible. And so they became more purely focused on the revelation, purely focused on being secondary. And so really the question I ask at this point, and we're going to dive into this more, but which one do you think the Greek religion is more of? Does it make sense that it's more of a primary natural religion, or is it a secondary revealed religion? I hope it's pretty clear that it's a primary natural religion, and it never focused on revelation like this. But we're going to look at that more specifically. So really, paganism was never a book religion, ever. Homer and Hesiod are poets. They're not prophets, and we don't really have an idea of prophecy. It's not really something that's a part of the religion. We have things like oracles, but oracles are not necessarily prophets, and the things that they say are often really cryptic and require some thought and interpretation. They're rarely something you can take at face value. And there's many stories in the myths about people taking what the oracles say at face value and ending up making kind of a mess of things, thinking they understand what the oracle means, and then they go off and act accordingly to what they thought, and it turns out that they kind of make the prophecy from the oracle come true. So in that sense, there's a kind of prophetic aspect to oracles, but they were never, coming up with large theological treatises or anything like that that were supposed to be taken in this kind of secondary religious way of being divine revelation. Secondly, Greek religion never really had a closed canon. This idea of taking Homer and Hesiod as being the only revelations and then everything after that is closed, well, that idea is completely foreign to Greek religion. They kept making more things, more works and myths for centuries. I mean, up until the end. One of the longest epic poems, the longest epic poem actually, that's written in the sort of Homeric style is the Dionysica. And the Dionysica was written, I think, in the 4th or 5th century AD, I think 4th century probably. I mean, it's one of the last things before paganism really gets shut down, and it's the longest epic poem we have. And I suspect that it would have been treated much in the same way as these other epics had paganism not been basically systematically destroyed. So there isn't a sense of a closed canon when it comes to Greek religion or paganism in general. Secondly, the Greeks always embraced inquiry from the very beginning. The idea of like a divine revelation that you can't question is just completely foreign to the religion. It was perfectly pious to ask questions about the gods and be curious about the gods. And we see this throughout all of the history of the Greek religion that we have, from Heraclitus, Parmenides, Plato. All of these people were asking questions about religion, taking their sort of rational faculty and wondering about the gods. And really, this is just a feature of primary religions, of natural religions. They all ask questions about the gods. They all engage in philosophy. And there isn't a sense that philosophy is something foreign to the religion that's, forbidden, and you're not allowed to question it. That's just not there. And, if you want to look for an analog to that, I would look over at Hinduism and Vedanta. The Vedanta tradition grows out of Hinduism and is asking questions about God and the gods, and is really the foundation of what we think of modern Hinduism to be, right? It's a major part of it. If you cut off Vedanta, you wouldn't get Vaishnavism, you wouldn't get Shaivism as we currently understand it, or any of the movements in Hinduism over the past 2,000 years, right? So it'd be really silly to try to cut something like that off and say, true Hinduism is just the Vedic religion from, 2,500 or 3,000 years ago, and everything after that is like some fake degradation. It's like, well, that's the vast majority of Hinduism. And what this really shows is that primary religions don't have this fixed revelatory thing. Even though Hindus would look at the Vedas and tell you that the Vedas are revealed and the Vedas are the divine word of God, they would go into that, no problem. They would say that to you. But the difference being, it's not closed. It's not like, oh, there's the Vedas and then that's it. There's no more revelations. There's no more access to God. We just have to stick with the Vedas forever. And there's nothing else after that. They don't have that mindset at all. They say, yeah, the Vedas are inspired by God, but so are the Puranas. So are the Agamas. So are all of these different kind of sutra treatises that we have, So are all of the Vedanta philosophers. All of this stuff is inspired by God. So it's open. It's not closed. And it's open to philosophical speculation. And, if you want a good example of this from the literature, I look no further than the Delphic Oracle. The Delphic Oracle says, let's go into what the Delphic Oracle doesn't say, right? The Delphic Oracle doesn't say, never question Homer, never question Hesiod. It doesn't say anything like that. It doesn't say really anything about a scripture of any kind anywhere. But the Delphic Oracle does say, know thyself. That's probably the most popular of the sayings of the Delphic Oracle, to know thyself, which is to question things, understand things, seek to understand. And if that's not enough for you, there's another one from the Delphic Oracle, become a philosopher. I think that one's pretty on the nose, that, if you're looking somewhere for a sort of divine injunction of how we ought to be, well, the Delphic Oracle says flat out, become a philosopher. So what this really leads to is, a broader mindset that I've noticed within this trend of Protestant pagans, which is that there's sort of this myth of like a pure archaic religion. They sometimes are calling this like pre-axial paganism and contrasting it to axial paganism, which the axial age is basically from, around 800 BC, through like 300 or 200 BC, somewhere around there. And so pre-axial would be anything before 800 BC, which is convenient for them because we don't have any writing from that period. Basically Homer and Hesiod are written around the 7th and 8th century BC. And so they're basically at the beginning of the axial age as Homer and Hesiod. And, they would say that those are emblematic of this pre-axial mindset. But, we don't actually have any other writings of anyone from before then. So it's kind of a blank check, I think, to write whatever version of paganism you want onto that. But what's worse is I think it's this flawed mindset That's just a logical fallacy that just because something's old, that means it's more correct or it's the pure version of something, right? As though like, oh, okay, I need to find the oldest version of paganism, and that's the pure paganism, right? As though paganism wasn't also shifting and changing in the Bronze Age and this pre-axial time, and that, religion didn't look different 10,000 years ago than it did 20,000 years ago. Like, these religions are changing and evolving over time. And so, it's this attempt to try to kind of fix a period of time and say this period of time is the gold standard. The Bronze Age is the gold standard of religion. And we have to just stick to whatever they did in the Bronze Age. It's like, why? Why is that the correct time period? This goes back to this secondary religious mindset where it's looking for a sort of fixed revelation, a fixed point in time where you can have, oh, this is the time period, right? And if it came out of this area, that's the age of revelation. That's the age of purity, and anything after that's degradation, right? This is a very Protestant kind of mindset. So, and the fact of the matter is, paganism evolves. And I always look to Hinduism when I want to compare it, because Hinduism is essentially just like the pagan religions of Europe, except it never got extinguished by Christianity or Islam. And so you can see how it evolves. The more I learn about Hinduism, it's like they had the Vedic religion, which was very much like the city religions of Europe, but over time they changed a lot. There were, philosophy changed some things within Hindu culture, and then you had all of these specific cults popping up of people focusing more on Vishnu and others focusing more on Shiva, others focusing more on Shakti or the Great Mother. All of these different cults kind of come up, and they develop their own philosophies, their own ideas, and all of it's a part of Hinduism, right? All of it's a part of that great tapestry, and each thing kind of adds to it and adds their own ideas, and it leads to this very open mindset. And this isn't just a problem with Protestant pagans. I think it's a problem with a lot of pagans that we treat paganism like it's dead all the time. We treat it as though there's no more new things. We can't create new things. We're just stuck with, trying to replicate the past. And I really think we got to get out of that mindset, because there's such a rich liveliness to something like Hinduism. And that liveliness really comes from the fact that they're totally willing to come up with new stuff all the time. And in their mindset, the gods are speaking to them every day, constantly. It's this living, thriving religion for them. Whereas I think paganism sometimes gets stuck in this kind of more Christian way of looking at religion, where religion is something that happened in the past, an event that happened in the past, and we're just trying to get back to that or analyze that and understand that, rather than it being something that we should be constantly seeking in the present moment and bringing that to the world and kind of expressing that in every way we can. But it's probably something for another video. So next, I just want to touch on the fact that these Protestant pagans really love to attack philosophy. And then maybe that's my personal reason why I want to say something about it, is because it's become this constant refrain that, Plato is this axial philosopher who's degrading the great pure religion of the Bronze Age or whatever. And I just think this is a really ridiculous position overall, for the reasons I've mentioned. Like, it's consonant with natural religions that we have a philosophy that goes along with what we're believing, and that we analyze and question things. That's perfectly a part of a natural religion. But there's also just some ridiculousness in like how close together these people are. They act like there's this huge gulf between Homer and Plato, but I mean they're separated by maybe 300 years. It's not a huge division between them, and there's a lot of people in between Plato and Homer. There's all of the pre-Socratics. There's the 7 sages. The Delphic Oracle probably wrote things in between there. Or those sayings of the Delphic Oracle became fixed in between Homer and Plato. And all of those still are leaning more in the direction of what Plato is talking about than in some sort of divine revelation kind of mindset, or is this secondary religion mindset that they've taken on. And really what that goes to say is, like, all of those philosophers, the seven sages and Plato, they're not trying to destroy Homer or anything like that. I think they get characterized as that because of some things that Plato wrote in the Republic, where he was critical of Homer, and Heraclitus was critical of Homer too. So was Xenophon. So there is this kind of criticism of Homer being a maybe not the best characterization of the gods. Most of the philosophers have kind of a higher view of the gods, where they wouldn't ascribe certain behaviors to them. And that's really it. I mean, that's the problem. They're just saying, poets like to do this. They like to kind of dramatize the gods in this particular way. But there's a theological mindset that looks at what the nature of the gods is, and it didn't look to them as that was consonant with what rationally made sense of what the gods had to be. If they really are these creators of the universe and governing huge aspects of the world, then it doesn't really make sense that they're doing all of these very human acts. And so it's a bit of a criticism on that, but that's not a problem, because we're not dealing with something that's a divine revelation that you have to take at face value. It's perfectly acceptable to question it. And that doesn't mean that they don't believe it, and that doesn't mean that they don't honor it. And I think this is the thing that confuses people, is like, you can read the Republic and see Plato make some criticisms of Homer, but if you read his other works, he says many times that Homer is the most divine of all poets, and really honors Homer quite a bit, and uses different quotes of Homer throughout his works. And the later Platonists do the same thing. There's some lost treatises, but people like Proclus wrote entire commentaries on Homer. Porphyry talked about Homer and the allegorical understandings of it. So they obviously treated Homer with a lot of respect, despite the fact that they didn't take it literally. But this just goes to back to that secondary religion thing. Do you have to take Homer literally? Is that a part of the religion? No, it never was, and it never will be, despite these people trying to make it a kind of divine revelation. So, I think the last thing I would mention is really just that, from a philosophical standpoint, there's a reason why reasoning and logic are a part of natural religions. And the reason is that logic and reason are part of the divine. We look at it like God gave us this ability to reason. And, we don't have a myth like they do in a lot of the secondary religions that encourage us away from inquiry and reason. We don't have a myth necessarily of, stealing the fruit from the tree of knowledge, and we have to stay away from reason. And we just have to put ourselves toward faith and forget that pesky reasoning, right? We don't have that kind of mindset ever. In fact, it's the opposite for us. We have this idea that we have the light of the gods within us. We have reason and a piece of the divine in our mind. That's what the nous is. It's a spark of the divine within us. And that's our access to God, is to use this to get back to something divine. And without it, we're really left in the realm of opinion. And we're never seeking true knowledge if we're not using our reason, the light of reason, to get ourselves to understand the divine. And so not only is reason and logic acceptable within the religion, reason and logic is actually how we get to the divine. It's the ladder that we're using to get back to the divine, rather than using something like faith and just trust in the revelation, trusting the plan, so to speak. Right? That's not how primary religions work. Sorry, my camera died there for a second. So what I was saying was just that reason and intellect is part of the religion. It's part of all primary religions. And, refusing to use it isn't reverence. It's really more of an ingratitude to the gods, and it's a rejecting something that the gods have given us. And was never a part of primary religions. But what we really see again and again and again is that myth, ritual, reason, philosophy, all of these things come together in primary religions and work harmoniously. And we really shouldn't be cutting off one of the best parts of our religion is that we do get to ask questions. We do get to inquire about the gods. We do get to wonder. And, we don't need to have, trying to return to some sola scriptura mindset from Protestantism is not going to be a benefit to paganism. It's basically going to give us the worst of both worlds. We're going to adopt really one of the worst things that Christianity ever did, which was, shutting off and closing the mind to really thinking about what these things are and elevating scripture above reason to the point where if something is logically true, and we know it to be logically true, but it goes against something in a poem, we have to go with the poem instead. So that's one of the worst things that Christianity ever did, and it's really part of the reason why Christianity is failing, I think, because they didn't allow enough for that kind of inquiry within the religion where people could think for themselves. And in today's world, that doesn't work anymore. When the church has control of everything, you can kind of make that work and force people into thinking that way. But it doesn't really work today when people can question whatever they want and we have the freedom to look into things. We want rational answers to our divine questions. We don't want another magical book that we have to follow perfectly and go, just accept without thinking. That age is past. And it was a mistake in the first place. The ancient world never did it that way. And it was a huge mistake to change and try to make, shift into this secondary religious mindset. And so for that reason, that's why we shouldn't be Protestant pagans.